Finally off on a trek, and I'm going to get a number of miles under my snowshoes here shortly, and it is really cold today. And I like to think of some history as I'm trekking along, so today I thought I'd talk a little bit, and it will be a wee bit of history because we're going to be talking about the Hudson Bay Company. So we're talking the oldest company in Canada, the most influential company in the history of Canada, hands down. I'm also going to be talking about its rival, the Northwest Trade Company, a bit, how ultimately they merged, and sadly what impact both these companies, colonization and the fur trade, had on the indigenous peoples. And I got to get some gloves on my hands. It's pretty cold. Anyway, I'm finally off. I'm going to leave chores, fort building, gun making, and get out and enjoy a little Canadian winter. I'm standing on the top of the house built by Castor canadensis, in other words, a beaver. And there's a very fresh set of coyote tracks right here, and they've been right up to the top where some of the snow is melted at the apex here, and they can smell all they want, but they cannot penetrate this. So before I get into the history of Hudson Bay and Northwest Trade Company and colonization, a little bit about the beaver itself. So aside from mammals, aside from human beings, it's the only mammal that actually engineers its environment. Others will build homes, of course, and birds build nests. But the beaver actually engineers a water system, a drainage system, that he can totally control the depth of his environment. And that's why he's safe here, because this is frozen solid 2 feet of ice around this, and there's no way predators such as this coyote or a fisher or a wolverine is going to get in and get the inhabitants of this warm house. In terms of warm, it's about it's above freezing inside this, driven primarily by the body heat of the animal. So typically there'd be about 4 beaver under me right now, and they probably are sleeping, or they can hear me chatting because they're primarily a nocturnal animal. Now I'm going to get out of the wind. I'm getting a little biting. I'm going to find a nice spot over here out of the wind, and I'll tell you a little bit of the history of how this little creature opened up a continent. And if you think about it, in order for colonization to happen, there has to be some benefit. So one of the largest benefits, if we think back to the Spaniards, they had the gold. They conquered the Incas, the Mayas, and the gold was just there for the taking. They became one of the richest countries, if not the richest country in the world. Well, the beaver to the English is what gold was to the Spaniards. And I'm going to get into how that was a good thing, I guess, in terms of opening up this country that I live in and call home for development, and the negative effect it had on the indigenous peoples that lived here. you might be wondering, what does a beaver eat in the winter if he's locked up in that house and sort of locked in by ice? But if there's openings such as the one you see here to my right, and often this can be caused by, I'm just on the cusp down here of a dam, so you're going to get some flowing water, which is going to create an opening that the beaver can get out. And back behind here you can see a fresh cut tree, and behind me here you can see one that they almost felled. And now what they're doing underneath the ice is they're eating away at these limbs that are below the ice. And the other thing they do in preparation for winter is they collect all this material. And they basically fasten it to the bottom of the pond or lake near their home, and they keep building that up, and basically it's their food source for the winter. So when they're hungry, they come out and get it. The other thing about this creature that is pretty phenomenal, they got this transparent lens that will cover their eye so they can see underwater. They have two glands that emit oil onto their inner fur. And that oil, they say that a beaver can stay immersed for 7 minutes before water will actually get to its actual skin. They can stay underwater for about 15 minutes, sometimes a little bit more. They have valves in their ears and nostrils that will shut the water off. And they've got this really neat structure in the back of their throat that allows them to grab a piece of wood and have their mouth open as they dive down and carry this log into their food cache or into their lodge without getting water into their lungs. So absolutely amazing creature that we're going to find out how really valuable it was. Still haven't got to the history part. Back to beaver again. It still amazes me how the creature can fell. And this is a hardwood tree. This is a sugar maple, one of the hardest trees we have in this part of Canada. They have incisor teeth, two top, two bottom, that continually grow through the life of the beaver. Lifespan can be up to 12 years, unless they're trapped. So they continually grow, and actually they sharpen each other. They kind of wear them down, and the wood wears them down. And as they're cutting the tree, they're actually sharpening it. So onto my wee bit of history. So 1660 sees the start of the Hudson Bay Company. It starts with a fellow by the name of Prince Rupert of the Rhine, and he's a second cousin to King Charles II, I believe. And he's issued a charter for all the trapping rights for all the waters that drain into the Hudson Bay, which is a vast area of Canada. It goes from the Arctic Circle down to northern United States, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Rocky Mountains. It's huge. But we also have the other influence that we have taken place are the French, who have been there a lot longer. And part of the reason for the formation of the Hudson Bay Company was to take away that dominance of that fur trade that the French had established along the St. Lawrence River. So we're not going to see the Northwest Trade Company is not going to be established for over 100 years after, I believe it's 1779. And that's going to be established by a group of Scotsmen who had worked for the Hudson Bay Company and were disgruntled and wanted to sort of take again that dominance that the Hudson Bay Company had over the trade. And they formed that in Montreal, and their focus was more on the interior. But if we step a little bit back in time in terms of the overall history of the fur trade, the French have established themselves along the St. Lawrence River and all its tributaries. And that trade is firmly entrenched with the indigenous peoples, and it's extremely lucrative for them. Problem is, we get all these traders now are flooding in, and they're sort of undercutting each other. It becomes a cutthroat business in the 1600s and early 1700s, forcing the Crown of France to implement a system where they issued permits or licenses. I believe they called them monopolies to certain individuals. So now we all know the term voyageur. Well, these were individuals that were legal and licensed to transport furs for trade. But we get into the coureurs de bois. Now these guys were the rebels. They were the They were the, I'm not going to listen to any rule from some king over in the motherland there in France. And they went their own way. The English up in Hudson Bay would call them the woods runners, and the Dutch down in New York area would call them the wood hoppers, I think. They had names for them. But they were just a person on their own. Anyway, you can't get into a story about the fur trade without the iconic trade blanket. And I'm going to get this one out, and we'll talk how this blanket really drove the industry. First of all, by the 1700s, we get into the 1700s, wool blankets made up for, there we go, I'm in. They made up for 60% or slightly over 60% of the trade in North America. So it showed how valuable and how important they were to the trade. And ironically, we think about the iconic Hudson Bay blanket. Well, it didn't come out for a number of years. They started to trade blankets, but they were purchasing them often from France. So this is an early French trade blanket. It's made by a fellow by the name of Robert Stone down in the States. It's probably as close to an authentic blanket as one can find. It's probably twice as thick as a modern Hudson Bay blanket. And the French they come up with the point system that we know today and still use today in Hudson Bay blankets. And they use the word empointe, which means to sew thread. And this one's authentic to the point that the thread for the 4 bars is actually sewn into the wool of the blanket. So it often dispel a myth that, okay, you needed 4 beaver to get this blanket and 3 if it was a 3-point, and they got smaller, of course, right down to a half point. And there were half points between all of them. So half point, 1, 1.5, 2, 2.5. Had nothing to do with it. It was simply a way to delineate the size of the blanket. It did establish trade. Obviously, a 4-point cost more than a 1-point. So the English now, Hudson Bay, didn't actually commission their first blanket till well into the 1700s. And it became that iconic one we see with all the colors that you see mountain men wearing, and even today it's still a popular garment with those colors. So one of the reasons the Northwest Trade Company was able to establish itself and become so competitive to the Hudson Bay Company was they sort of modeled their business plan after the French. Insofar as they would take their trade goods to the natives, where the British, the Hudson Bay Company, with their forts and outposts pretty much around the Hudson Bay area and certain other major river systems, they'd have to have a middleman, indigenous mostly, that would bring the furs to them versus the Northwest Company, as I say, going out to the natives. So that was a real setback for the Hudson Bay Company. And we've got all kinds of rivalry happening. It's not a pretty picture in the wilderness. And on a portage, if the two companies were to run into one another, it often resulted in the use of these. So a very turbulent time. And I'm going to fast forward a bit now into 1821, where they finally merge. And one would think that they would have merged Hudson Bay Company with the Northwest Trade Company, but it turns out it goes the other way. It's interesting too, the Northwest Trade Company tended to have better trade goods, and natives knew that, so that was also bringing competition there. One thing the Hudson Bay Company wanted to get rid of desperately was trade silver. It was expensive, and they liked cheaper goods. So after the merger, the Hudson Bay Company quickly dropped that. But we kind of envisioned this being this small industry. It was far from it. In today's dollars, it would have been billions of dollars that crossed the Atlantic Ocean in those fur bales. At different points in time, we get into the 19th century, we've got upwards of 500 Hudson Bay posts across Canada, and into northern states, Washington, Oregon. So it's a massive industry. And it's not going to start to decline until well into the 19th century when basically furs were, the poor beaver was almost extinct. The hat had long since gone out of favor. Furs in general were down. But the Hudson Bay Company, in their wisdom, decided to diversify, and they went into retail. So when they'd opened up the Red River Valley system, for example, in Manitoba, at the same time Canada was trying to push the Dominion, for lack of a better word, across this vast country, they started to open retail stores. Those retail stores are still in business today. They're called the Bay. So a lot of people became very rich. The fur trade, particularly in the beaver trade, opened this continent. The big losers, it's pretty obvious, were the indigenous peoples. Ultimately, the loss of their land, the loss of their culture. On a positive note, they are getting that back. There's a huge movement by indigenous peoples. I 100% support them. The beaver have come back, and we can thank that to a fellow by the name of Gray Owl, or Archie Blaney, aka Gray Owl, and we did an episode on him. Probably Canada's first conservationist. When the beaver were just about gone, that man started to educate people on the value of them. And if we think about their value today, if you're a landowner and they've flooded some valuable timber, you don't think much of beaver. Or in a municipality and your culverts have been clogged, you don't think much of a beaver. But what they do, if we don't have beaver, all the waterways that we think of would go unchecked. The erosion, the loss of land and valuable timber and resources would be gone. They buffer that, they monitor it. They create these vast areas of wetlands that are home to thousands of species, so that we get the biodiversity from them. These little engineers, and they're fascinating to watch. They're hard to watch because they're, as I said, they're primarily nocturnal. But if you're patient, you'll get to see beavers. Anyway, it's starting to get colder. The sun is getting lower. I got to get some firewood cut and get my tea belly on.